So wonderful. So our guests today, we have Leora Fridman, class of 2007, who is a multidisciplinary writer whose work is concerned with issues of identity, care, ability, and embodiment. She is the author of My Fault, selected by Eileen Miles for the Cleveland State University Press First Book Prize, in addition to her books of prose, poetry, and translation. Her work has been supported by Fulbright, Creative Capital, and the NEA. Leora graduated with honors from the University of Massachusetts Amherst MFA, and we want to welcome Leora. And our guest today for her book is Sunisa Manning, 2007, who was born and raised in Bangkok to a Thai mother and an American father. She graduated from Brown with a degree in English literature. And her book of note today is A Good True Thai, and it's her debut novel, and it can be found at Point Reyes Books. So welcome you both, and I'm gonna pass it off to Leora.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's so nice to see so many friends. I'm really glad to be here today to have the opportunity to speak publicly with Sunisa about her book, something that's been in process for a really long time, and a book that I really value. And I have, probably 3 hours worth of questions ready for her, but I will restrain myself, and I would love to hear your questions, and I know that she would too. So please, as Lisa said, feel free to put questions in the chat. No question is too small. Sometimes, as a teacher, I always say sometimes the most stupid questions are the best ones to answer. So please feel free to put questions in the chat. And I know that many of you have read the book and not all of you have, so we will also be kind of introducing certain aspects of the book. I'm going to ask Sunisa a few questions, and she'll read a little bit, and then we'll kind of go back and forth. So, Sunisa, we are here as friends, also among friends, and also brought together by Brown. So I wanted to start with speaking a little bit with you about the role of friendship in your book and the role of stories of friendship in your book. And I think that something that's really interesting to me about what drives this as a novel is that the role of love and infatuation is in some ways equally important to the role of friendship and the role of friendship love as a driver of action. And I wanted to just kind of hear you speak to that a little bit more, how you think about friendship and romance in the book. I think there's a lot of subtlety to how these characters kind of sometimes have slippage between being lovers and being friends. Some of them may have been better off as friends than lovers. There are a lot of questions in the book also about how the people we desire as our amorous partners or married partners are as much informed by social and familial conditions as by personal taste or personal desire. I'm thinking first about the friendship between Det and Chang, as well as the evolving kind of love triangle between Det and Chang and Lek. But I'd love to hear you say anything you'd like to start with about friendship and romance and how relationships drive the book.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see so many friends. Miss you in this crazy time, but thanks for coming. This is my first event where I received the second edition of my book. So I'm just wanting to share that, I get to, my first edition is well thumbed, and I'm keeping it here in case I want to read from that. But it's really thrilling for me to get to check this one out. And I just wanted to show you because so many of you are friends. Look. So yeah, this book is about 3 young people in 1970s Thailand who radicalize, and they begin in high school and go through college. And when I thought about how I could get them to, particularly the one with a lot of privilege, like the most highborn one to radicalize, it's just a time when it's your friendships that pull you into things, right? I teach adolescence. I feel a lot of tenderness towards some of the madness of adolescence. And I feel like for me, when I thought about what might be credible, it had to be friendship and that draw, to be within a social group. And then, of course, love also, because when I studied this period, when I was researching, I found that members of the highest class had radicalized in 1973. Thailand is a really small country, but like everywhere, if you radicalize, you would be really giving up some of your privileges. And so I was looking for ways to access something that was historically true. And I found I had to give people friendships and use that to make them move classes, see outside their class. Like we had to have friendships outside of class. And that ended up being more complicated than I'd initially thought, because now and then Thailand's very stratified. So when I thought about having Det, who is super highborn, I was like, okay, he's going to become friends with someone who is really what is called a commoner, which sounds super harsh in English, but there we are. I was like, there aren't that many places they would actually meet. Literally different schools, different streets, different circles. And so some of the inventions of the book were really just dictated by needing to find places that would be plausible. And then we went from there. And, a love story, like following a girl, is a really good reason to throw a lot of things away if you like girls. So that's also where that came from.
I want to ask you more. I'll ask you more about this later, but I think part of what you're saying also makes me think about the locations where people meet and form relationships, which also seems like really relevant to this particular gathering, whether people went to Brown or not, like thinking about what are the locuses of relational activity almost in our lives and when that happens. So I'll get to that later. But also, given what you just said, I wanted to ask you more specifically about writing about romance and a love story together with politics, because I think that's something that you are doing really beautifully, and I think in a really risky fashion in this book, because I think that people often raise questions about whether romance and politics obscure one another, prevent one another, support one another. And, I think I certainly have plenty of my own opinions about the fact that, I think it's mostly patriarchal oppression that makes us think that the relational is somehow less than or separate from the political. But I think in this particular context, I'd love to hear you speak to how you thought about situating the romances in this book in the context of the resistance movements and state repression in the 1970s in Thailand. And to me, it seems that the personal stories in your book are clearly both representations of social positions of the time, and you are educating us a lot through them, but they're also characters and hearts themselves. So I'd love to hear you speak to, how do you hope to see the personal or the romantic intersect with the political in this book?
Yeah, I think for me, from a craft perspective, it was just a really clear way in. How was I going to get these three characters? So there's Det, who's descended from royalty, highborn, Chang, who is from, again, in Thailand, and I would still call it a slum, although I realize that has real connotations in English. But in Klong Toi, where I actually used to spend some time. And so I was like, okay, I can put a character here. And then my own Thai family are Chinese Thai, and I knew I wanted to have some gender and ethnic commentary, because it's different to be Chinese Thai versus Thai. So I gave Lek that. I worried a lot that this book would be too intellectual, and it is very intellectual, and I love that also. But I wanted to give readers a way in, and that's a lot of why the romance happened. As it turns out, there was some feeling in American publishing that it was too intellectual, and that we wouldn't want Americans to flex their brains concerning Thailand or something. So that concern was valid and also so invalid. But I also think, David Foster Wallace wrote about this in an essay a long time ago. It's an essay about Joseph Frank Dostoevsky. And David Foster Wallace was writing about how an American author would never dare to be so political and earnest about its politics. Has anyone read the essay? You know what I'm talking about? it's really good. But he said, Americans would be teased in a review for being as earnest as the Russians are. But this is why there are no great American novelists, much as we try, because we cannot get to the issues of the heart, and the intellect is not fully formed without that. I'm saying it poorly. It's a very beautiful essay, Joseph Frank Dostoevsky. But I remember reading that and recognizing that as someone so I'm an American and I'm Thai, I hold dual citizenship, but that if I was going to write from Thailand, I wasn't going to have the ability to not be so earnest and political, because it is political. It's a very small country. It's the most stratified wealth disparity in the world. So I was just going to aim myself at the Russians with like apologies for being teased for my earnestness, and that's what I did. And I also, as many of you know, but it's worth saying, aimed myself at Tolstoy, War and Peace, because it's my favorite book, not necessarily a novel, but it has the same love triangle, and it takes, by using the characters, it takes you through all of life, through all of war, through I don't think you'd say that the characters radicalize, but they figure out how it is to be an adult in their own ways, and they're on those journeys. And of course, in this age, the age of my characters in the book, that's all we want to know, like, how are we going to do this, and what are we going to live for? And those are earnest questions, but who doesn't go through that? So I tried to actually forget a lot of kind of an American model of literature in that sense, the novel in that sense, and went so old fashioned. But I went with the greats. So I'm feeling good about that too.
We're also feeling good about it. You were starting to touch on this a little bit just now, so I wanted to kind of follow you a little bit more to the issue of kind of not necessarily, although inclusive of your own transnational identity. I'm thinking also about the ways that the characters in this book bypass multiple worlds, and that's a lot of how the action moves, is also kind of moving across worlds. We're talking about how friendship also moves people across worlds, but I'm thinking specifically about Det, who has one parent who is a commoner, as you said, and one of nobility, and Det's relationship to privilege, to use sort of the American wording, and Det's relationship to privilege and how he inherits it drives a lot of the plot. And there's this really interesting conflict where he feels loyalty to the monarchy he's in part descended from, but he also has these kind of revolutionary sympathies. So he's really a character with kind of one foot in multiple worlds. And I wanted to hear from you a little bit more about to what extent you see this as a book about people who find themselves traversing or caught between multiple worlds, and how you worked in the book to do justice to both, or to multiple of those sectors of society that you're speaking to.
Yeah, one thing I really have been enjoying about Leora's questions is like how much we get to flex our brains as we talk about this book. I was like, I'm really interested in hybridity. I think, most, if not all of our identities are hybrid forms, and that they tend to be the most interesting, with apologies to people who don't consider themselves in a hybrid identity. But, as someone who is biracial and like bicultural, I really identify as someone who has to hold things in common that might not fit so easily together. But that in those discrepancies and complications, there's really a lot of power. Det, so he has a split, and it's by class, although he is male. So he gets to be kind of the little prince until he isn't. And I think that's really interesting. I think that has a lot of force. And again, like fiction, you're looking for force and direction, and it can send, Det's revelations about his birthright and the things he thought were true that aren't always true, sends him in directions of revolution. And I really needed that to happen. The other character who has that is Lek, because she's considered Thai and beautiful, and she's gendered, but she's Chinese. And at the time when she came of age, as my mother did, that was like it wasn't great, And so there's always a conflict in the way that Det, even when he meets her, maybe we could read soon, but when he meets her, he's like, she's beautiful, she's Chinese. It's like, whoa. But that just makes her so much more interesting and captivating. And hopefully, I was thinking of Natasha in War and Peace and the way she has this incredible dance scene where she seems to embody the spirit of Russia. And like, who gets to write about that? I was really trying to be like, gosh, what if we had Lek as a heroine, because there's something about the Thainess she can talk about accessing it as an outsider, an ethnic and cultural outsider who's learning Thainess. It's the place of her birth. It's not the place of her parents' birth. Chang, he's Thai, as you say in Thai, and he's from Bangkok. He's from Klong Toi. And yet somehow he's like a little flatter, like he has a class identity, but there's not as much there in ways because I don't think he does have enough hybridity. And I've been thinking about that and thinking about, in the context of further work, like how to keep complicating everyone. But I had enough of a challenge also. Like I really had a lot on my plate with my first novel, 3 point of view characters, historical research, censored historical research. So at the time when I was researching this, there's a lot of pushback personally, socially for the things that I was curious about. And I'm not sure if I did it over again. I think I would choose a different project and then I'd like work up to this, but such is the force of ambition. We went with it. So, yeah.
Do you want to read a little bit? I think I want to ask you more about research, and I also want to ask about this sort of really interesting writerly question about how to keep complicating characters. But let's hear you read a little bit first. Do you want to read? Tell us what you're going to read.
It's going to be really short because I think being read to on Zoom is like a form of torture. But it feels weird not to actually read from the book in an event about the book. So we're going to keep it short. Can I give you the choice actually? I'm just going to do one reading, and it's either a kind of romantic encounter, like the first when Det meets Lek for the first time, or a short reading that's about the way that the US or the West views Thailand, and there's a part that ruminates on that. Can we get a vote? If you're not on camera, you can do reactions and hit raise hand or thumbs up. Can we do that? Like teacher mode happening. Okay. Yes, Victoria is there. So who wants the romantic reading?
So let's get a thumbs up for the romantic reading if you want that one, and save your thumbs up if you want the second one.
Okay. And then who wants the one about like the West looking at Asia, Thailand? Okay. Oh, it's pretty close. Leora, what did you think?
I think let's start with your first one, and then if we have time, we can read the second one too.
Young, you didn't vote. Okay, cool. If you have the book, it's page 31. So we have 3 characters, Det, Chang, Lek. When the first years of Chulalongkorn University are rushed, the upperclassmen give Det a wide berth. Join us, Chang yells as he's led away, but Det only smiles. Important people are never part of the fray. A senior sweeps his hand across a driftwood log before indicating Det should sit. You wouldn't want to get dirty with them, the guy says, before he is whisked away to torture the incoming class. One student after another is grabbed, blindfolded, and marched down the beach. Det perches on a log. The world tries to protect him. In officer training camp, he had been ensconced with the highborns in the classroom, watching commoners like Chang run drills. But then Det insisted on going outside, because his ancestor, King Chulalongkorn, was wily, capable. The thought bounces Det off his warped seat. He sinks his ankles in the sand and churns his way down the beach. You have to act in order to lead. He catches up with Chang as his friend is being blindfolded. Do me too, Det says. The senior holds his hand out for the next blindfold, but hesitates, fingering the cloth instead of whipping it around Det's face. Chang, in the meantime, is spun around. He grins and sways and swears he isn't dizzy. Det puts his arms out. No rope binds his wrists. Det waits, knowing how hard it is to resist the permission to treat a highborn as commoner. Chang is pushed into a group. Now find your way to the ocean. Everyone's feet have to touch the water. There are shouts as the first years are shoved in different directions. They're knocked over like bowling pins before Chang begins to corral them. Typical Chang to get the hang of it, calling from which way to go from within the middle of the pack. Oh, he doesn't want to get involved in this. The guy who's spoken has wide-set amber eyes that flash in dark skin. He wears a ratty t-shirt, loose navy pants, and mismatched flip-flops. The set of his shoulders betray easy authority. You are, Det says. Sing. Sing surveys Det from toe to crown as if he were a museum specimen that he would be pleased to put into a glass case. What if something should happen to you, Sing says, then we'd really be on the line. From the way Sing's accent weighs down his words, Det guesses Sing is from the South. Det presses his lips together. The guy seems to be one of those who resent the power people like Det have. Det's in for teasing, maybe a harsher initiation, but Sing spins away and runs, kicking sands as he goes towards a different group. Just ahead is a crowd of girls. One tall girl shrieks as she rolls a peeled longan in her outstretched hands. Thick strands of black hair cascade down her back and flow over her shoulders, reaching her ribcage. Don't make me eat it, she cries. Look at those hands, slim and tapered. That upward turn at their tips, perfect for Thai dancing. Det watches the seniors push the eyeball toward her. She chews it at the front of her mouth, lips pursed until she recognizes the taste of grapes. Laughing, the seniors pull the blindfold from her face and Det starts. She's Chinese. He can tell by the way they flock around her that they find her attractive too. She's brushing her hair out of her face and turns her attention from person to person as she congratulates them on the trick. Their eyes meet, and Det flicks his gaze up the beach. He climbs a low dune, brushes sand off a different log, and straightens the crease of his pants. As he turns to sit, the girl has appeared. She presses her perfect hands together in a greeting and seats herself, tilting back with a sigh. The wind whips her hair into a small hurricane. She lets it fly, closing her eyes. Everything about her is long hair, long face that ends in a pointed chin, long limbs that seem to go on forever. What did they make you do? She asks. Her eyes are deep black half moons in a startlingly pale face. Though she speaks seriously, her cheeks create triangles that frame and lead his eyes to the peaked indent of her full top lip. Me? I'm Lek, she says, dipping her head. She speaks in flawless Thai with no twist of a Chinese accent, and she has the look of the lantong tree, the way it stands in the wind, sways, and is not broken. The arched branches, the oblong leaves, the spray of milky flowers with a deep gold drop. I'm Det, he says, managing to sound unsure of his own name. He clears his throat, wondering if he should have snapped open his full name and title, like an umbrella giving shade. Mom Luong Akaran, pleased to meet you, but call me Det. Lek nods. Did you eat an eyeball too? No, he says. I'm just sitting. Then he winces. Someone appears to lead Lek away, and Det bobs his head and studies his knees. He glances up in time to see Lek regard him as she goes over the rise of the bluff, led away by both arms. She raises her eyebrows and widens her eyes in alarm, and Det answers her with a smile, hoping the warmth spreading through his face isn't too earnest. Unable to help himself, Det stands in time to watch her lie down. The seniors jostle to be the one to tie her ankles together. She becomes a log in a row of freshmen for them to roll over. Det rubs his neck, turning away, tightening at the thought of lying next to her.
Thank you. It's so nice to hear. I don't consider Zoom reading to be torture personally. It's really nice to hear you read. In some ways, it's just like, the receiver in me just likes to be like, okay, just let the words wash over me, So thank you. It's also really beautiful to have the opportunity to hear it in your voice. I wanted to, as you were just reading now, I was just thinking a lot. Obviously, I was thinking a lot about gender, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about kind of the way you thought about gender and feminism in this book. Something about the scene that you just read, and also you mentioned something a few moments ago about Det's maleness and how it affects his ability to traverse different worlds. And I know that you have a lot of thoughts about what it means to think about gender and feminism across nation states and their different ways of experiencing those things. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the character of Lek, how you formulated her, and also perhaps like how you imagine, given that we're talking about this book in the US, as much as we're in a location, how do you think about a Western audience reading her, understanding her, and understanding her experience of gender?
I've never been asked that question before in a lot of events. Yeah, it's tricky because Thai society is still super hierarchical and like restrictive. In American terms, we would call it a patriarchal society, you know, which it is, but conservative. And so I felt really limited in a book that's obviously set in Thailand in a certain time by what you can do within the parameters in ways that would be interesting to me. I think that something I enjoyed about Lek is she is always conscious from the beginning when you meet her, and she's only 16 then, that she's performing her gender as much as she's performing Thainess. But she's someone, because of this ethnic difference in her immigrant, you know, background, she's performing everything. And so she doesn't feel that as a burden, which it is, until later, when she starts to have some models and examples who are like, why are you doing that? That's weird. And there's ways in which I thought a lot about how to, I think this is still true, that the higher you get in Thai society, the more constrictive the gender expectations are, which isn't true everywhere. You know, but so I got to spend a couple years in the Thai countryside. I spent a lot of time with rural folks, and I was always struck by like how salty and free a lot of Thai women could be when we were out of Bangkok, but that there was a way in which, like at Det's echelon, which is not what I'm a member of, but I got to spend time in this social strata, partly because, by the way, I went to Brown, and there are a lot of highborn Thais who go to Brown. They went to Deerfield before, you know. It allowed me to have entree into a society that I am not eligible in as a Thai person, that I got to see, oh, that's really restrictive up here, but like the same people out in the country can do things that they can't do in the city, and they can speak in ways that they can't. And the language is very restrictive and it's gendered. This is going to relate, but this year I teach high school, and I'm teaching like a special, just like Thai cooking project. And I had my students for 17 pick, you know, families and pick Thai names to be in family. Some of them don't identify as men or women, but if they're picking a Thai word, it's gendered. And so we literally are sitting there, and I was like, stuck between these categories where I was like, well, not sure how to tell you how to say this word, because, and so that's like a really recent example where I was like, this is a problem. But there's a lot of ways in which that's a problem, you know? So yeah, in the context of the book, like Lek is performing her Thainess, she's performing her gender. She's really good at it. She gets constantly affirmed. It's like, wow, I couldn't even tell you were Thai. Like the section I just read with Det, right? Where he's like, she doesn't even have a Chinese accent. That's so condescending though. And then, yeah, Lek meets Dao in the countryside. And Dao is like really a catalyst for all three characters, but like for Lek particularly, to shake it out a little bit. I loved that. I loved getting to write these encounters with a Thai woman who isn't bound and refuses to be.
Thank you for that. I also love that story with your students. It's really interesting also to think about the texture of the language and how that works. And as I know, you know, like I grew up speaking Spanish and have lived in Spanish-speaking places where, you know, most things are also gendered, or we refer to people, you know, with an A or an O ending. And a lot of people these days in Mexico specifically are starting to like default to an E ending as like a non-binary gender ending, but it's still super clumsy, you know, like, and I think it's really exciting, but it's also like you know, the pace at which language adapts to cultural understanding and phenomena, and also is specific is in place, you know, like that's happening in Mexico City, I can say, you know, but not necessarily other places. And I would be interested to know if that might happen, or how that might happen in your teaching or with your students too. But I wanted to also just ask you, just because we were kind of wandering in that territory, I mean, I know that you've thought a lot for years about how you're generally bringing this story to life in a Western context, given that you were living in the US for a lot of the time that you spent writing it. And I think also for me, particularly as a white reader, I also really admire how this book tends to present Thai cultural reference points without always explicitly explaining them. so that I, as the reader that I am, felt that I was welcome as an audience member, but not always being catered to, like not always having everything explained to me. And I'd love to hear you kind of speak more to how you made those choices, how you thought about audience in this book, how you kind of wanted to think about where it was landing nationally, transnationally, in terms of language and in terms of cultural reference points.
Yeah, this is something I really struggled with. I joke, but also mean it when I say that I had to give myself a second MFA after my American MFA because, you can learn kind of craft things around like plot and characterization. Most of us don't actually learn about plot, but time, point of view. But if you're going to write as a person of color or someone who's a member of the tribe of the oppressed in any way, and also from a different country, it's like a whole nother set of things. I'm only just now being able to articulate some things I've thought that have crystallized in this novel, one of which is that I think it makes more sense if you think of this novel as translated by me. And I think there's a way, and also, so this novel was published in Singapore, quickly went into a second printing. It's a bestseller. Still not available in the States outside of a couple bookstores here. It's not published in the States. But I think it would have flown in the States if it was translated, because that discomfort of feeling as an American that you're not totally being talked to might have made more sense. This is a problem that a lot of colonized countries run into. I'm thinking of Singapore, Malaysia, where a significant population, India, but not a problem because they have their own market. A significant population will read and write and be educated in English, and yet they might not want to cater to the Western gaze or to an American or British audience. Thailand wasn't colonized. I couldn't have written this book in Thai. And then interestingly, I think politically, I it would have been a bad idea. And when I finished the novel, Brabda Yun, who blurbed the book, he's a writer I respect very much. He's Thai. He told me, he's like, he read the book and he was like, it's going to be banned. Are you ready? Have you talked to your family? Like, we went through this whole thing. I had to go through this with my family because they all live in Bangkok. And I had thought a lot about the line between what I could say and not say. But the fact that it's written in English and it's paper, which isn't searchable the same way, really works in my favor. And so, this is a unique story in English. It's more explicit than a Thai writer with only a Thai citizenship living in Thailand would probably ever want to take. And then, of course, the novel came out in the midst of a student democracy movement that moved the goalposts so far beyond what my book did that, I'm going to touch wood, I could still get in trouble, but I'm not saying anything that hasn't recently been said now instead of what the book was. And I don't regret this. It was like breaking some news and that made me feel really nervous. But I also felt a responsibility as someone who has American citizenship, wrote this book, in a way from exile. I did get to go back, but the distance helped me go through what I had found in the archive and process and write about it and fictionalize it and put it in narrative in a way that if I was living in the kingdom, I would really have struggled with. And as it was, there were a lot of very real conversations with family, with friends, with people I researched the book with who were just like, don't concern yourself with this. No. There was a lot of intimations of social ostracization, and yet when it came out, and the cover is so good for this, it's a house on fire. The book really is in that spirit. But when it came out, I was like, see, everyone knows they're already marching. The house is on fire. I just pointed it out. So I was lucky that way.
It's also such an interesting writerly concern to consider, like, when distance is helpful. You were speaking to like being far away, allowing you to write the book politically, but also in terms of safety, but also it sounded like to me in terms of your writerly process, And I think about how there are moments when we're completely immersed in the material of what we're working with and moments where we actually can't be in order to write about it. And I also just you started to speak to this, but I wanted to ask you to just talk a little bit more about the kind of current anti-repressive movements and student movements that are taking place. I know it was in some ways it wasn't on purpose that your book was released during, a time of great protest and uprising. And to what extent do you see connections between these uprisings, these recent uprisings, and those described in the book? Or what connections do you kind of want your readers to make to their own contemporary context or wherever they might be?
I think when I was writing the book, I wanted to talk about Thailand and power and lack of opportunity to move class-wise from where you've been born, unless you're born at the very top. And it was so dangerous to talk about that and talk explicitly about the monarchy that I'd heard about this thing in the 70s. My mother and uncle went to the universities in the novel, and they didn't radicalize. I asked my mom why once I got into it, and she was like, too poor. I knew I had to get a job. I couldn't. But, I found in this time period, I felt like is the term an Easter egg? It's like a game term where I could smuggle my own investigations into power and opportunity into a time capsule and have the perfect excuse, which I have used in context with a lot of Thai people, and it works, just to be like, oh, I didn't know it was going to come off like that. I wasn't even alive then. Gosh, And this is the ways in which performing gender and youth can be really helpful, because I'm not actually like that at all. So, I got the cover that I needed. Once the book came out in the midst of a huge democracy movement in Thailand, I got a lot of questions from people being like, did you predict this? How did you predict this? And of course I didn't, and one can't and doesn't. But if the problem hasn't changed, you're liable to have expressions of the same problem come up. And so I went to the archive and read from writers like Jit Pumisak, who is in the novel a lot. He's one of the epigraphs with one of the kings, and his work really informed my own process of political awakening in a Thai sense. Students today are doing that. Jit Pumisak is one of the intellectuals. He was assassinated in the 60s, who is accompanying them. And so we're finding the same, saints, and we're going through the same journey. And it's just really interesting that Jit, for example, is threaded through the whole novel. And I left it there, breadcrumbs. I wanted someone to be able to get my book and see it. And then if it mattered to them because they're Thai or whatever, for them to keep going with that. Thai people don't tend to read in English, only really educated people do. But it's been interesting as I learn what the audience is, that there are a lot of obviously English readers, Westerners, but people who have a deep connection to a country that they've been really shut out from. In terms of Thai people are really good at being like, we're just a really hospitable place and there's nothing else happening. Look away. We love the king. And that's not the whole story, but it's a convenient story. The same way I'll be like, I wasn't alive in the 70s. Whoops. And so I feel like this book really gives you this deep dive into all the things we don't typically talk about. I recently got a note from a woman who's Canadian. She's an ambassador to a lot of countries, including Thailand, to the UN. She's just really high powered and has spent a lot of time in Thailand. And she's like, this book is the book that I was I knew something was there. And I was like, here it is. And so it's a niche audience, but it's one that really wants to go deep with this. Yeah.
I really like that last piece you just said about the kind of performativity of okayness, to give it an official kind of term, and how gender or race or class kind of play into when we perform okayness, and why, when it's helpful to us, which I know changes a lot in different contexts. It also it feels especially relevant right now, thinking about kind of pandemic times and when people feel like they have to perform okayness, and what kind of disasters or traumas allow people to stop doing that or to reduce the amount of time that they spend doing it. I'm going to ask Sunisa another question, but I would love to hear questions from all of you. So feel free to put them in the chat and I will read them out. Again, just a warm welcome to any, even the simplest of questions. Sunisa, though, I wanted to ask you, you started talking a little bit about Jit Pumisak, and I wanted to talk about him a little bit more. So for those of you who haven't read the book, he is a revolutionary writer who plays a large role in this book, in these characters' lives, in their own radicalization. And I think that this novel is so writerly in that sense because the main characters are really constantly referring back to text, and text is really important to them in terms of how they attempt to kind of parse and formulate their own lives and their own opinions. So I want to ask you sort of how you found him, how you decided to place him in this role in your novel, and if you feel like talking about it, if there are writers who play a similar role in your own life, so texts that you return to again and again to kind of understand yourself and your own politics, your own development.
I found Jit poking around in the archive, as I like to do, and I live near UC Berkeley, and just like came across a book that mentioned this assassinated intellectual, and I think there was a line that was like, he was like the smartest mind in a generation, and we gunned him down. I was like, whoa. And once I found his writing, which isn't largely translated, there's a little bit, it was too good not to use. I put him in the epigraph, which I'll read. And I really would love questions in order to see you as we say bye. But, you know, the epigraph from Jit is, the Thai people of today are fully awake. They have been able to identify clearly the enemies who plunder them and skin them alive and suck the marrow from their bones. I was like, whoa, as revolutionary writing goes. And then the other epigraph is King Chulalongkorn, who Det is descended from. And the epigraph is this: democracy in Thailand must be different from democracy in the West because Thais eat rice, not wheat. And like in those two, between those two temples, you can make an entire novel. I did. You can make several novels. I just felt like he, yeah, as I mentioned, was just a guiding star. I didn't make up his writings. I didn't make up the poetry that, you know, comes up in the novel without giving too much away. I didn't have to. I mean, it's really quite amazing to have all that ready. And nowadays there aren't many photos of Jit. He was killed very young, but on social media, you'll see people using the same black and white photo because people, yeah, it's like a kind of a code for being a certain kind of democracy participant. They'll have like their profile photo is Jit. So, you know, that's all still there. I do a lot, you know, at Brown, I study post-colonial literature. It really gave me the intellectual firepower to think about everything I had to think about to make this book and beyond, I think. And the people I still read, like Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, there's a new biography out of him, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, like this is all their nonfiction, but like there are ways in which the Black American struggle in the way that like Morrison and Baldwin are able to articulate that were things that I could really draw on. And then Fanon and Said talk about the experience of being the dispossessed of the world and Thailand. So, yeah.
I'm going to give you a little bit of a softball, just given because you were talking about reading those writers at Brown, and I'm curious to hear if you want to just, given our context, also just reflect a little bit on what role Brown played in the creation of this book, whether it's you were beginning to speak to what you were reading, or how you were thinking, or the connections that were formed there interpersonally or intertextually. Yeah, any part of that you'd like to answer.
Oh my God. It's like impossible to quite put all the words and parameters around how important Brown was for me. And it's funny because I was in classes with a lot of you. But, you know, intellectually, it was really important for me to understand things that I had grown up within. And again, like post-colonial narratives, post-colonial literature, like that really gave me a framework. It was great to be so challenged there. I was raised within a very conservative patriarchal culture. And so like having permission at Brown to just start to elbow out of those forms and see what was going to happen. And I think I'm glad how academic it was. And then I'm glad how also in some ways non-academic, you know, Brown could be, that like we weren't just about the classroom, and I did a lot of creative things that that, yeah, all led in this direction. Also, Brown has been so supportive of this novel that is not published in the States. It's really amazing. So that's also been just really touching. Like, I think it's an institution, my experience of it, which is just mine, but that has a lot of heart in ways that I think are hard to capture, but you know it when you're within that system.
I had a question come in that I'd like to pass along to you, which was about translation. I think this is meant literally. So the question is anyone seeking to translate the book into Thai from English, or is that too politically treacherous or risky? And I'm curious if you'd like to offer an answer to that, but also I guess I would just add to that question too, what's it been like for this book to be read in Thailand that you know of, and how has that response found its way to you?
A couple people have come forward in terms of translation, but nothing's shaking out yet. I think that it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But copyright is really an issue in Thailand. And so I'm going to have to think really deeply about kind of like my property versus our property if we want to go that way. Although I'm really interested in it, I think, just to reach more people. I get a lot of feedback through social media, which has been cool and interesting. And then, the Thai population that I hear from the most are Thais who are educated in international schools and or like Western colleges. It's been a book that's like really passed around in there, and people talk about it with me. They want to get into it. I think it's great. I mean, there are the internet has allowed a couple news outlets that are pretty dissident oriented to flourish. And those reporters talk to me about my book. Like, it's a funny world, but it's a really knowing one. And when I was doing this, it felt so lonely. So I'm really only ever thankful for this.
That point of loneliness too, like, I think is such a common one. I remember once when I was, I think probably right out of Brown, writing to like one of my hero writers and being like, hi, would you like to have coffee with me? Which I feel like I only had that courage probably because of like Brown inflated my self-confidence. But I remember writing to her and she wrote me back. I think I said, do you want to have coffee with me? I'd love to talk to you. And then there was some line in there about, sometimes I feel alone in my practice or in my writing practice. And she wrote back, this is so sweet. I don't have time. The loneliness is important. And I was just like, or something like the aloneness is important. I was like, thanks. I think that's we could talk about that, for hours. I know you and I could talk about like the dynamics between isolation and community around writing. But I'm also curious, I don't know, I wonder if you'd like to say more about, as your friend and also surrounded by friends made possible by Brown and other things. I wonder if you want to speak to the role of writerly friendship in your work, like how you think with or alongside others, how that affects your writing, when you choose to let other people into your work or when you don't, those kinds of things.
Yeah. I actually think of writerly friendship with also writers who are dead, which, but like Tolstoy, I think about a lot, or Flaubert, whose Madame Bovary is in the book. And, I really like to thread texts that were instrumental to me as I wrote something into a book, because I feel like then you can experience it with me. Like, we can have all of the layers, maybe. And if you don't want the layers, don't have them. And so like I learn a lot, or like Nabokov's lectures on literature, I learn a lot actually through association. It's not friendship, I guess, because we don't actually have a relationship with books of eons past. And then, yeah, in a concrete way, the Ruby, which is a workspace for women identifying artists in San Francisco, has provided me with a lot of writer friends, still alive, most of them. And we've been able to read each other's manuscripts, and there are a lot of women of color. And so there can be an analogous situation that we're going through, and then sometimes not. And I learn a lot from that too. But yeah, I have some friends from there who edit my manuscripts. And, there's a line between like, there are a lot of people who want to be writers, but there are quite few actually who are like really doing it, who haven't gotten there yet. But the Ruby has a lot of those. So I'm really appreciative of that.
I think the friendship with the dead is so important. I think that's so important. I mean, there are also a lot of questions there, I think almost in terms of what friendship and relationship means. Like you said, you don't actually have a two-way relationship with those people, and yet perhaps there's an increased intimacy in the fact that like you don't have to deal with the constraints of everyday life together. You can just be kind of spiritually haunting one another. I think that also is really, I remember one of my teachers once, I think his mother had passed away, and I was asking him what was bringing him comfort, and he was like, I've only ever counted on books, and that's what's going to carry me through. He's kind of a crotchety teacher, but I think there are those moments in a writer's life where you're just like, oh, I have my library, moments like the last year or two.
Right, but a lot of us, I think, became writers because we had that experience too, where it's like you could live within books, and then suddenly you're an adult and wonder why that you only wanted to live within books. It's like, oh, too bad. I'm stuck here. Yeah. So
yeah. I've had a few questions come in. Are you open to taking a few more?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, does anyone want to unmute and ask? Because I would love to see and hear you, as our time draws to a close. And I don't have to see you, but if you wanted to ask them too, you can. Leora, you want to direct like whose question you?
Dan, do you want to offer your question? I think it's a really interesting question. Also thinking about what Sunisa has shared thus far.
Okay, sure. After writing this book, being multiracial yourself and living through the last year where work life became more hybrid for many, do you think that those who are multiracial are uniquely positioned to adapt to the recent changes to our culture?
Because work life became hybrid? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Wow. I don't know. I don't know that I feel like my racial identity is so tied to like, switching between in-person and Zoom interactions per se. I have always worked from home. So like luckily I'm pretty set up for home life. Luckily, and with a lot of privilege. I do think though there are many advantages to hybridity, right? Because I mean, one of the things about like hybrid thinking is often that you can't create such neat categories and speak so completely about a people, etc. And I think often if you're mixed race, you might not look quite like one side of the family or another, and so you're also maybe getting to practice those leaps and asking those people to make those leaps with you, where you can belong without being able to be like, yes, if you put us in a photo, we do, you could tell that we're blood related. So I think there's some really beautiful things about that for sure. I enjoy it. It's also tricky. Yeah.
John Corcoran, can you please share your question?
Hi, it's so good to see you. Congratulations. We met in writing classes 100 years ago at Brown. So this is so nice to see you on the other side. Sunisa, I'm curious, after writing and publishing this and now existing in the world, how do you personally feel that your relationship with Thailand has changed since writing this book? Has your relationship to the country, to the geography, how are you feeling these days?
Oh, that's such a good question. I never would have guessed this, but it's kind of released some things. Like I have less to prove, if that makes any sense, because I've like read about Thailand a lot, and it's like, whoa. And so sometimes when full Thai people, and Dan, this is something that happens to me in terms of being mixed race, in Thai it's called lukrung, half child. Sometimes when Thai people are going to be like, well, you're not really Thai, you wrote it in English. I'm just like, whatever, people, because often I've read more about Thai history, or in particular contested history, like things around the monarch, where I was like, no, I've I've come of age within Thailand too, and made my own opinions, which are only mine. But just as in the way, if you're raised within a religion, as an adult, you'll want to try on those systems and see what works for you. And maybe you're going to leave, or maybe you're going to adapt, or whatever. There's an analogy to that with Thai-ness for me, where I've tried on and I feel really like, no, I know where I stand in this, and that's okay. It's allowed me to also find my people in interesting ways. I mentioned, just there, it gives me kind of like a legitimacy and a platform so that people who like share my political views they're reaching out, and we're getting to know each other. And, with the first novel, you're just toiling in the dark, and people can be like, but now that it's here, they can read it. We can meet. And then, I wanted to say, I live next to Cal, and I've been really interested always in meeting academics who specialize in Thailand, because my research is so academic. But there can be a way in which academics buy into the hierarchies of Thailand. And I am descended from immigrants. And so I've sometimes felt a little like cut out of that circle of being like, no, I don't have a title. And the book, it kind of allows me to stand on my own 2 feet that way too, and just be like, yes, untitled, proudly so. It's okay, So I've really enjoyed that.
Steph, would you be willing to share your question?
Yeah. Hey, Susie. So you've kind of touched a little bit on how the student movement of the past year has put into contrast the work that you did in writing about the student movement of the 70s. And I'm wondering, in terms of like audience and approach, when you think now back at the choices that you made editorially in terms of plot, now that this second movement has occurred, how, if at all, would you have like reconsidered or shifted the content given that loosening of lines that you described happening this past year?
Whoa, good question. Yeah, off the bat, I wouldn't actually change anything, but I will tell you about something that almost didn't happen. So the book, takes place between 73 and 76. This thing happens in 76. All Thai people know about it, usually won't talk about it, particularly not to anyone else. And the book almost ended in this way that was pretty violent. And my editor, thank God, was just like, you really want to work on that ending? Like, is that what you want to leave everyone with? And because my own predilections fall towards sympathy towards the radicals, although they made a lot of mistakes, and, I see that, I was like, no, probably not wanting to end with traumatizing them. And so I was able to put, in a Buddhist sense, you would say like my sincere wishes, but like really my sincere wishes for young people and people in Thailand into the book by extending that ending and by writing it in a way that not going to talk about too much because it would give things away, but just like I feel encompasses what I learned and not just the scary stuff. And it just kept going. And so I feel in the context of today and what I see happening, just a lot of hope, even though some immediate news is like really hard to hold. And I really am excited for people to see the end of my book too, because it kind of gets at that horizon instead of just ending in the muck. So I'm glad my editor pushed me on that. Really glad.
Little pulling back the curtain of how much changes in a book, which I know changed many times and in many other ways for you as well before the final version. I think we're going to bring this to a close. Thank you all so much for your questions and for your attention, even during the late spring of Zoom burnout. Really appreciate your presence. And I'm sure that Sunisa is open to additional questions. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, please send them her way. I think most of you probably can find her. And thank you again to the Brown Club of San Francisco for having us, for celebrating Sunisa. If you don't already have a copy of her book, it's really easy to get, even though it's not published in the States. You still can, thanks to local bookstores of the Bay Area. So if you don't already have it, please do make sure you get it soon. Thank you all again. Lisa, I'll turn it over for you in case you want to say anything in closing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Leora and Sunisa, and all of you for sharing more of your time on a two-dimensional medium as we're kind of actually with the Brown Club actually creating more in-person events, hopefully for the summer. Maybe we might be able to see some of you live and in person sometime soon, but just want to thank you both for your creativity and your curiosity and how much book clubs have been so important to all of us in the past year. And I'm just thinking of our last Brown alum that we shared with the Brown Club, John Gazvinian, class of 96, who wrote a history of Iran. And so, through this medium, we're able to travel when we can't go anywhere and meet people and remind ourselves about people in places that are not monoliths, and that we do need to dig deeper and get more intimate with everyone. So thanks again. And you can find us at Brown Club of Greater San Francisco on the interwebs. And hopefully we'll see some of you sometime in the future. Thanks so much.